Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars and welcome back to another Luthier's Quick Tips. In today's episode, I'm going to show off a new acquisition into my workshop, and that is this big beast. This is the X-Carve Pro from Inventables, and it is actually my third CNC machine. The first CNC machine I had, if you'll think back probably 5 or 6 years, was the original X-Carve from Inventables. And I had that machine for several years. I pushed it to its limit. And after 3 to 4 years of using that machine, I decided it was time to do an overhaul. I needed to replace some parts and I wanted to upgrade a few others because that X-Carve was the first edition of the X-Carve. And in the years that followed getting that machine, Inventables upgraded and improved it. So I decided the time had come to where I needed to overhaul my machine, bring it up to the new specs, and hopefully breathe some new life into it. Well, when I started looking at the cost of doing that, it occurred to me I could just buy a new machine, and I actually considered doing that. But then I decided, let's design and build a machine. And I decided to do that because I had noticed there were a lot of other guys who were doing the same thing. They were designing and building their own CNC machines. So I thought it might be kind of a fun project to do. So for the next 6 to 8 months, I spent all my time designing, acquiring all the parts, and then building what I affectionately refer to as Old Yeller. And that was the CNC machine that I used for the next several years. And that machine served me really well. It worked fantastic. And I have not a single complaint against it. In fact, I didn't really have any complaints against the original X-Carve either. It worked great for me. In fact, I like to think of the original X-Carve as sort of being like your first, Epiphone Les Paul or Squire Stratocaster. It's not a genuine Fender or a genuine Gibson, but nevertheless, it works and you enjoy it and you learn a lot when using it. But eventually you get to a point where you want to have that genuine Stratocaster from Fender or that genuine Gibson Les Paul, which means a significant investment and you're hoping to get your money's worth. Well, after using Old Yeller for a while, I started to think about how I would like to have some improved capabilities. And as a result, I had to make a decision. Did I want to design and build a new machine? Or did I just want to get something that was already done? And I was kind of at a point in my business where I really didn't want to spend a lot of time designing and building tools. I was much more inclined to want to use the tools to build the things that I like to build. That's where I wanted to focus my time. So I didn't want to go back in and design a new machine. And that's why I decided to go with this X-Carve Pro. And I'm going to bring you in, kind of give you a quick tour of it, the Highline Guitars 50-cent tour, and I'll show you why I decided to go with this machine. There were a number of reasons why I decided to buy the Inventables X-Carve Pro, but probably the most important to me was I know the company. I've been dealing with Inventables since the first X-Carve, and I like the company. I like the people that work there. I like the fact that they have their own software, their Easel Pro software that you can use with their machines. I like the quality of their support. They have a community, an online forum community that you can tap into for advice on using the machines as well as ideas for ways to modify them, different projects that you can do. And speaking of projects, they have a whole library of projects that they offer which you can cut out on your X-Carve. And so I was familiar with the company and I felt really comfortable using them. However, when they introduced the X-Carve Pro, like a lot of folks, I went to the website to check it out, and one of the first things I noticed was the price. this isn't a cheap machine because it's really aimed at professional level CNC operators. And I thought, wow, that's pretty expensive. But when I started doing research into the type of machines that are offered by the competition, I began to realize, you know, this is actually a pretty good deal, especially when you consider that you get the Easel Pro software to use with it. And while some folks won't use Easel Pro, you can use pretty much any software that you would use to generate G-code for a CNC machine. However, having that Easel Pro, I've found more often than not, that's the program I'll go to for almost all the work that I do. Even if I'm generating my own G-code, I'll import it into Easel Pro and then send it to the machine. It's just so much easier. It's sort of a seamless way of working. But another thing that I discovered with the X-Carve Pro in comparison with the competition is that the cost really is dependent upon what you get when the machine arrives. And some machines will arrive pretty much fully assembled and ready to go. All you've got to do is just, you know, maybe do some fine-tuning adjustments and then plug it in and you're ready to start working. But the cost of those machines goes right through the roof, is significantly higher than the X-Carve Pro. Now, when the X-Carve Pro arrived, it came in a large box, and it's basically 3 assemblies. The 2 Y-axis assemblies, and then the big X-axis gantry. This whole thing has been assembled at the factory along with the 2 Y-axis assemblies. What you have to do is bolt these 2 together with cross members that run underneath this wasteboard back and forth. Then you have to lift up and install the gantry onto the bearings on the side. Bolt that together. Then it's a matter of laying out your pre-wired drag chains, plugging those into the controller, which is down on the floor here. Then you can plug it into the human interface, which allows you to connect your computer. And at that point, you're pretty much ready to get going. And what Inventables will do is they've got Easel set up to kind of walk you through your setup to make sure that everything is working properly. And it also allows you to plane flat the wasteboard. So once you've done all that, you're ready to go. And Inventables will say on their website that it will take you about 2 hours to get this machine assembled and up and running. And I think that's true if you've got someone helping you. But if you're working alone, as I was, it's probably going to take more like 3.5, maybe 4 hours. And full disclosure here, I spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to find a couple of tiny screws that I dropped on the floor while I was assembling it. So subtract that out and you're probably looking at about 3 hours total if you're working by yourself. But to put this thing up on top of the machine, you're definitely going to need someone to help you. This is just too heavy and too awkward to do it by yourself. And you have to have someone standing on each side so you can get it lined up with the bearings and start installing the screws to bolt it all down. Now, another reason why I decided to go with this machine is it's a beast. With my old Yeller CNC machine, I had pretty good strength and stiffness in the machine, so I could run it at pretty decent speeds. But I felt like if I was going to upgrade from that machine to a new machine, the new machine was going to have to be even stronger and stiffer than the old one was. And this machine goes so far beyond what old Yeller was that they're not even in the same realm. The sides of the gantry are cast aluminum. This whole structure is thick, heavy-duty aluminum. The Y-axis structures are heavy, incredibly thick aluminum extrusion. There is zero flex in this machine. So I'm pretty confident not only can I cut aluminum, but I could also cut brass, and I think it's possible to cut steel with this machine. I don't see any reason why I couldn't. Now, it doesn't come with a a lubricating coolant system. However, you could add that yourself, and I think that's what most people do anyways when they plan to do that. Adding that to this would add to the cost, and let's face it, I think that probably half the people who buy these machines probably are just going to be cutting wood with it and will never cut aluminum or any other kind of metal. But if that's something you think you might do, I definitely think this machine could handle it no problem. But the other thing I wanted to do when I upgraded was I wanted to go from the Acme lead screws that I was using with Old Yeller to ball screws. Because in the beginning, when I had the original X-Carve, that was a belt-driven system with V-wheels. And that works okay, but it requires quite a bit of regular maintenance to ensure that it works properly all the time. And I wanted to get away from that, and that's why when I designed Old Yeller, I included the Acme lead screws. And I could have gone with ball screws, but at the time that I built that machine, the Acme lead screws were a much more affordable option than ball screws. So I went that route. And that worked pretty well. I didn't have to worry so much about frequent adjustments in order for it to work properly. However, I decided when I went from Old Yeller to a new machine, it made sense to upgrade to ball screws. Now, the biggest difference between ball screws and Acme lead screws is Acme lead screws, there's quite a bit more friction involved in their motion. So as a result, it takes a lot more torque to turn the lead screws, to move the gantry back and forth, to move your Z-axis up and down, and to move the spindle side to side on the X-axis. So with ball screws, there's almost no friction at all, and they move much more easily, so you don't need as much torque and power to run them. As a result, you can move the machine much, much faster without the risk of losing steps. Now, in Old Yeller, that machine worked great as far as over the years that I used it. I don't think I ever missed a step once. And so when I decided to upgrade, I wanted to make sure that when I did upgrade, I was going to get a machine that would continue that history of never missing steps. I hate missing steps because that'll ruin a whole project. And all it takes is to miss a couple of steps and you got to start over, and what you've been working on you've probably is ruined and has to be tossed out, and you got to start with a fresh blank. But with these ball screws, I'm confident I'll never lose steps with those. And what's really nice about this particular machine, most of the machines that I checked in competition with this one are using 16 to 20 millimeter ball screws. These are 25 millimeter ball screws, almost an inch in diameter. These things are huge. And that just kind of gives you that little extra confidence. It's almost like they're over-engineering the machine. And I've said this in the past before. In my opinion, when someone says they over-engineer something, it's kind of a cop-out because they don't know how to engineer. Well, because of the length on both the X and the Y axis, Inventables felt it was necessary to go with the 25 millimeter to avoid sag. Sag can cause you to lose steps when you're moving at high speeds. So I think that this machine is going to be able to run pretty fast, and we're talking feed rates, with this size of ball screws. So that's a nice bonus. With the original X-Carve, linear motion was handled with V-wheels. And V-wheels work okay, but they do require frequent maintenance in order to ensure that they work properly. When I designed and built Old Yeller, I made use of SBR type linear rails, which use bearing block guides. And that worked really well. Well, that technology has advanced, and with the X-Carve Pro, they're making use of that technology by utilizing Highwind style linear rails. And the biggest improvement is really for the manufacturers of the machines, because these are much smaller in profile than your SBR type rails. With the SBR type rails, you end up with a much larger structure to support them. And these are much more compact. And they are very low friction, so movement is extremely easy. And they're serviceable in that you can just apply some lubricant to keep them running smoothly. However, with the X-Carve Pro, they recommend that you lubricate it after 100 kilometers of travel. So you're going to be running this a long time. And I would imagine you'll probably be lubricating the bearings maybe every 6 months or so, maybe twice a year. So that makes it really easy and low maintenance to operate. The spindle that I used on my original Inventables X-Carve as well as Old Yeller was not actually a spindle. It was a DeWalt DW611 trim router. And it worked okay, but like I said, it's not a true spindle. A spindle which is designed specifically for CNC work is engineered to a much higher standard. And with the DeWalt 611, it was producing a maximum of about 1.25 horsepower. Now the Inventables X-Carve Pro comes with a true spindle. It's an air-cooled 1.5 kilowatt spindle. That means it's about 2 horsepower, so almost double what I was getting from that DeWalt 611. And that's important because a lot of people, when it comes to understanding the speed of a CNC machine, they assume that feed rate is where the magic lies, but it's not the feed rate that's important. If you want to cut the time it takes to make a part with a CNC machine, it's depth of cut and step over that matters, and that's achieved with higher horsepower. So if you go from 1.25 up to 2 horsepower, you can make much deeper cuts with much larger step over, and that's going to dramatically reduce the time it takes to carve something. Being able to increase the speed that you move the gantry in your spindle doesn't save as much time as you might think. It's that depth of cut and step over that's important. And with the DeWalt 611, I could get maybe at the most about 25% of the bit's diameter as far as the depth of cut was concerned. So if it's a 1/4 inch bit, I could get maybe at the most 1/8 of an inch depth of cut and about 1/8 of an inch step over. But even that was pushing it. The router just didn't like that kind of depth of cut and step over. But with this machine with 2 horsepower, I can easily achieve that and even more. So I'm going to be able to dramatically cut the amount of time it takes to cut a part. Also, since a spindle is precision engineered, there's far, far less run out at the bit than there is with the DeWalt trim router. The result means that I'm going to get a much higher quality surface finish in the parts that I cut than I was ever capable of getting with that DeWalt 611 trim router. Another advantage to using a true spindle as opposed to a trim router is the fact that the spindle is a VFD or variable frequency drive spindle. That means you can control the speed at your computer rather than having to run up and adjust a knob on top of the trim router. This is important because spindles have a much wider range of RPM, and that RPM can be dialed in to the specific type of material that you're cutting and the bits that you're using. That can all be determined at the computer. Now, don't be concerned that you may not know a lot about spindle speeds and depths of cut and the types of bits or anything like that. You don't really need to know that because with Easel Pro software, you can tell it what the thickness of the material that you're cutting, the type of material, and the bit that you're using, and it's going to calculate your feed rate, your depth of cut, your step over, and the spindle speed for you. Of course, if you're knowledgeable about this stuff, you can override it in Easel and dial it in for specific situations as well. Now, this machine also comes with a really cool dust shoe that actually works. I've found in the past with dust shoes I've used on Old Yeller as well as my original X-Carve, They didn't always do what they were supposed to do. I still found myself having to clean up a lot of dust after cutting out a piece. But this thing works pretty well, and you can raise and lower the chute and place it directly onto your workpiece and tighten it down, and then the spindle itself moves up and down independently and carves within it. Of course, you have to make sure you're aware of the thickness of your stock and how deep you're making your cut so that you don't run your spindle into the dust shoe. But if you don't want to use the dust shoe, it's pretty easy just to pull it off and set it aside. And I've got the hose currently connected to my 4-inch turbine dust collector, and that thing really sucks out the dust, so I'm pretty happy with that. The machine also came with a Z-axis probe, and what that does is it allows you to automatically set your Z-axis height, and you simply place this brass piece onto your blank or whatever you're carving, and you connect to the spindle shaft, of course without the spindle running, and then you plug the other end into the human interface into the front of it. And what this does is it allows you through software to lower the bit down until right as it just touches the top of that brass, and then it reverses back out or back off it by a specific amount. And so the machine will know exactly where the surface is. There's no more guessing. You don't have to turn the bit to make sure it's just touching the surface of the work or try to slide a really thin piece of paper underneath it. None of that. So that makes it much easier to use. And this human interface, it's basically like a supercharged emergency stop. This is what connects your computer to the controller on the CNC machine, and does so with a Cat5 cable as well as a USB cable. And you've got your emergency stop button. You also have a pause, a cancel, and a resume button. So if you're in the middle of a cut and you get a phone call from the missus that you can't miss, you can just hit pause, finish your call, and then hit resume and keep on cutting. So that's kind of a nice feature to have. Now, one of the selling features that really convinced me about the X-Carve Pro is the working area. Inventables has taken a really interesting approach to the whole idea of working area. This machine as it stands right now is a 4x4 foot working area. Now that's way bigger than pretty much any guitar project that I would ever encounter. However, there are some projects I'm thinking about doing down the road, some of which are unrelated to guitars, that will require a larger working area. But what Inventables has done that I think is really clever is they've kind of captured the functionality of a 4x8 foot CNC machine, but in a 4x4 foot footprint or working area. So how do they do that? Tiling. In Easel Pro, you can tile a project. So if you're going to be cutting parts out of a 4x8 foot sheet of plywood, instead of having to buy a 4x8 foot CNC machine, you can tile the wood with this machine. So you would do 1/2 of your cuts into your 4x8 foot sheet of plywood, and then it would stop, and you could then slide the board forward and finish the rest of your cuts. So you're getting the functionality of a much more expensive 4x8 foot CNC machine, but in a footprint that's only 4x4 feet. So that's a big selling point for me. That's the kind of functionality that's, I think, really clever. Now, whenever you buy an item that requires some assembly, usually the tools aren't included, or maybe some of the tools are included. Well, with the X-Carve Pro, you get a full toolkit that includes sockets and wrenches and hex keys, pretty much everything you need to assemble the machine, including this nifty little torque wrench. Because when you insert screws into threaded aluminum, if you over tighten them, you run the risk of stripping out those threads, and the torque wrench will prevent you from doing that. The X-Carve also came with a a selection of bits to get you started, and it also comes with a bunch of clamps so I can clamp my work down to the wasteboard. FedEx delivered my X-Carve on Monday at about noon, and by 3:30, 4 o'clock, it was running and ready to go. And the only issue I had during the assembly process was getting the wasteboard to fit properly. Because once you've assembled the machine and got everything leveled and lined up properly and then tightened down, I found that the mounting holes were a little bit of a challenge to get them lined up. But you know, I wiggled things around and got it into place, and everything was installed properly. The wasteboard comes in 2 different pieces, and you know, that just makes it easier for shipping. If you were to try to ship a big 4x4 foot wasteboard, that's going to be a bit of an expense. So doing it in 2 pieces makes it a little bit easier. And then planing it down was a pretty simple process. It just required the use of one of these, this is an Amana wasteboard planing bit. And that got it nice and smooth, nice and level. Now a lot of folks don't seem to understand what a wasteboard or a spoil board is for. I see guys going to great lengths to try to protect their wasteboard and their spoil board from damage. It's meant to be damaged, and I expect that this board will probably last maybe a year before I have to replace it. In fact, I'm thinking if I do replace it, I may actually go with some T-slot aluminum extrusions, which would run the length of the machine. And there are screw holes in this machine in multiple places that will allow me to do that. So I have that option. And then I can, instead of using a wasteboard, I'll just use a fixture wasteboard, which I can place on there, which will actually facilitate the alignment of the blanks that I carve on this machine. So that's something to consider with this machine. All right, guys, well, there you have it. The new addition to my workshop, the Inventables X-Carve Pro. The only thing I have to do now is come up with a name for this machine. After all, the machine I was using before, the one that I designed and built myself, I was calling Old Yeller. And I think with this machine, I'll probably call it the Beast, because it is a beast. At any rate, if you enjoy watching videos about guitar building, especially guitar building with CNC technology, hit that subscribe button if you don't already subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications. If you want to show my channel some support, head over to eguitarplans.com and purchase a plan either for a guitar or one of the different kinds of tools that I use to build guitars, like my buffing machine, my drum sander, my flip top tool stands, and even Old Yeller. I offer plans for that. And I also have a set of plans for a pickup winder. And I know a lot of you keep asking about the CNC winder. I'm still testing, but I'm just one guy in one shop, and I've only got so much time, and a machine like that takes a lot of testing and experimentation to get everything just right. So hopefully 2022, that's about all I'm gonna say. But be patient, I think you'll like it. And, you know, please give this video a thumbs up. And as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.